situated between the hippocampal gyrus and the anterior part of the fusiform gyrus. The sulcus circularis, circuminsular fissure, is on the lower and lateral surfaces of the hemisphere. It surrounds the insula and separates it from the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. The lobes of the hemispheres. By means of these fissures and sulci, assisted by certain arbitrary lines, each hemisphere is divided into the following lobes: the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, the limbic, and the insula. Frontal lobe, lobus frontalis. On the lateral surface of the hemisphere, this lobe extends from the frontal pole to the central sulcus, the latter separating it from the parietal lobe. Below, it is limited by the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure, which intervenes between it and the central lobe. On the medial surface, it is separated from the cingulate gyrus by the cingulate sulcus, and on the inferior surface, it is bounded behind by the stem of the lateral fissure. The lateral surface of the frontal lobe is traversed by three sulci which divide it into four gyri. The sulci are named the precentral and the superior and inferior frontal. The gyri are the anterior central and the superior, middle, and inferior frontal. The precentral sulcus runs parallel to the central sulcus and is usually divided into an upper and a lower part. Between it and the central sulcus is the anterior central gyrus. From the precentral sulcus, the superior and inferior frontal sulci run forward and downward and divide the remainder of the lateral surface of the lobe into three parallel gyri, named respectively the superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. The anterior central gyrus, gyrus centralis anterior, ascending frontal convolution, precentral gyre, is bounded in front by the precentral sulcus, behind by the central sulcus. It extends from the superior medial border of the hemisphere to the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure. The superior frontal gyrus, gyrus frontalis superior, superior frontal gyrus, is situated above the superior frontal sulcus and is continued on to the medial surface of the hemisphere. The portion on the lateral surface of the hemisphere is usually more or less completely subdivided into an upper and a lower part by the anterior-posterior sulcus, the paramedian sulcus, which, however, is frequently interrupted by bridging gyri. The middle frontal gyrus, gyrus frontalis medius, medial frontal gyre, between the superior and inferior frontal sulci, is continuous with the anterior orbital gyrus on the inferior surface of the hemisphere. It is frequently subdivided into two by a horizontal sulcus, the medial frontal sulcus of Eberstaller, which ends anteriorly in a wide bifurcation. The inferior frontal gyrus, gyrus frontalis inferior, subfrontal gyre, lies below the inferior frontal sulcus and extends forward from the lower part of the precentral sulcus. It is continuous with the lateral and posterior orbital gyri on the undersurface of the lobe. It is subdivided by the anterior horizontal and ascending rami of the lateral fissure into three parts. 1. The orbital part, below the anterior horizontal ramus of the fissure. 2. The triangular part, cap of Broca, between the ascending and horizontal rami. And 3. The basilar part, behind the anterior ascending ramus. The left inferior frontal gyrus is, as a rule, more highly developed than the right, and is named the gyrus of Broca, from the fact that Broca described it as the center for articulate speech. The inferior or orbital surface of the frontal lobe is concave and rests on the orbital plate of the frontal bone. It is divided into four orbital gyri by a well-marked H-shaped orbital sulcus. These are named from their position the medial, anterior, lateral, and posterior orbital gyri. The medial orbital gyrus presents a well-marked anterior-posterior sulcus, the olfactory sulcus, for the olfactory tract. The portion medial to this is termed the straight gyrus and is continuous with the superior frontal gyrus on the medial surface. The medial surface of the frontal lobe is occupied by the medial part of the superior frontal gyrus, marginal gyrus. It lies between the cingulate sulcus and the superior medial margin of the hemisphere. The posterior part of this gyrus is sometimes marked off by a vertical sulcus and is distinguished as the paracentral lobule, because it is continuous with the anterior and posterior central gyri. Parietal lobe, lobus parietalis. The parietal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe by the central sulcus, but its boundaries below and behind are not so definite. Posteriorly, it is limited by the parietal occipital fissure and by a line carried across the hemisphere from the end of the fissure towards the preoccipital notch. Below, it is separated from the temporal lobe by the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure, and by a line carried backward from it to meet the line passing downward to the preoccipital notch. The lateral surface of the parietal lobe is cleft by a well-marked furrow, the intraparietal sulcus of Turner, which consists of an oblique and a horizontal portion. The oblique part is named the postcentral sulcus, and commences below about midway between the lower end of the central sulcus and the upturned end of the lateral fissure. It runs upward and backward parallel to the central sulcus and is sometimes divided into an upper and a lower ramus. It forms the hinder limit of the posterior central gyrus. From about the middle of the postcentral sulcus, or from the upper end of its inferior ramus, the horizontal portion of the intraparietal sulcus is carried backward and slightly upward on the parietal lobe and is prolonged under the name of the occipital ramus onto the occipital lobe, where it divides into two parts, which form nearly a right angle with the main stem and constitute the transverse occipital sulcus. The part of the parietal lobe above the horizontal portion of the intraparietal sulcus is named the superior parietal lobule, the part below, the inferior parietal lobule. The posterior central gyrus, gyrus centralis posterior, ascending parietal convolution, postcentral gyre, extends from the longitudinal fissure above to the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure below. It lies parallel with the anterior central gyrus with which it is connected below, and also sometimes above the central sulcus. The superior parietal lobule, lobulus parietalis superior, is bounded in front by the upper part of the postcentral sulcus, but is usually connected with the posterior central gyrus above the end of the sulcus. Behind it is the lateral part of the parietal occipital fissure, around the end of which it is joined to the occipital lobe by a curved gyrus, the arcus parietal occipitalis. Below, it is separated from the inferior parietal lobule by the horizontal portion of the intraparietal sulcus. The inferior parietal lobule, lobulus parietalis inferior, subparietal district or lobule, lies below the horizontal portion of the intraparietal sulcus and behind the lower part of the postcentral sulcus. It is divided from before backward into two gyri. 1. The supramarginal arches over the upturned end of the lateral fissure. It is continuous in front with the postcentral gyrus and behind with the superior temporal gyrus. The second, the angular, arches over the posterior end of the superior temporal sulcus, behind which it is continuous with the middle temporal gyrus. The medial surface of the parietal lobe is bounded behind the medial part of the parietal occipital fissure, in front by the posterior end of the cingulate sulcus, and below it is separated from the cingulate gyrus by the subparietal sulcus. It is of small size and consists of a square-shaped convolution, which is termed the precuneus or quadrate lobe. Lobus occipitalis. The occipital lobe is small and pyramidal in shape. It presents three surfaces: lateral, medial, and tentorial. The lateral surface is limited in front by the lateral part of the parietal occipital fissure and by a line carried from the end of this fissure to the preoccipital notch. It is traversed by the transverse occipital and lateral occipital sulci. The transverse occipital sulcus is continuous with the posterior end of the occipital ramus of the intraparietal sulcus and runs across the upper part of the lobe a short distance behind the parietal occipital fissure. The lateral occipital sulcus extends from behind forward and divides the lateral surface of the occipital lobe into a superior and inferior gyrus, which are continuous in front with the parietal and temporal lobes. The medial surface of the occipital lobe is bounded in front by the medial part of the parietal occipital fissure and is traversed by the calcarine fissure, which subdivides it into the cuneus and the lingual gyrus. The cuneus is a wedge-shaped area between the calcarine fissure and the medial part of the parietal occipital fissure. The lingual gyrus lies between the calcarine fissure and the posterior part of the collateral fissure. Behind, it reaches the occipital pole. In front, it is continued on to the tentorial surface of the temporal lobe and joins the hippocampal gyrus. The tentorial surface of the occipital lobe is limited in front by an imaginary transverse line through the preoccipital notch and consists of the posterior part of the fusiform gyrus, occipitotemporal convolution, and the lower part of the lingual gyrus, which are separated from each other by the posterior segment of the collateral fissure. End of section 14.